again, Sophie Glenn here, and today we're going to be talking about the table saw. Now the table saw is broken down into a few different videos just to sort of keep all the information straight, and there is a lot of information that goes along with the table saw that we need to be aware of. So I figured the more videos we have in a shorter amount of time, the better. So it's going to be a little easier for you guys to remember how the table saw works. So this first one is just going to be about the general safety precautions you want to take when using the table saw. So about this table saw in particular, it's from a brand called SawStop, and what's nice about SawStop, it's the only table saw brand that has a really exciting safety feature to it, and that is if it detects any kind of moisture, metal, or meat, it'll stop the machine immediately. It does that because there's actually a cartridge in there that will read any kind of object that creates an electrical current or that can carry an electrical current, again, like moisture, metal, or meat. So once it detects that, it'll pop into the saw blade and actually stop it in place and lower the blade down into the table. For the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to demonstrate that, but if you did want to see that, there's tons of videos out in the YouTube world where they demo this on a hot dog. So just type in hot dog table saw and I'm sure you'll find one. So you can see how that technology works, at least in the YouTube universe. But it's a really nice feature to have in a school shop in particular because it's a little bit less of a liability than some other table saws might be. And in another video I'll get into more of what that cartridge looks like and explain how it kind of works. But again, for just the purposes of introducing you to the table saw and the SawStop in particular, that's sort of like the basics that you would need to know about that. Moving forward, we're going to be talking about the safety precautions about this particular tool, so I'll get into that. Of course, just like all the other machines, you want to make sure that the area is clean and that the table saw itself is clean. I have some stuff over here just using as demos, but typically you'd want the whole table surface clean. You also want to make sure you got your safety glasses on, which I have on my head here. All right, so I might as well put those on. I've got my earmuffs because again, it gets loud just like all the other woodworking machines in here. So those are ready to go there. And you might even want to wear a face shield for this because there is a lot of dust that gets flung up in your face and there could be a possible kickback, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So it's really nice to have a face shield on as well. Again, I probably won't wear one for the purposes of this video just because it's a little bit easier to talk through it. It's a little bit easier to dictate what or sticulate what I'm doing or whatever that word is. But do be sure to at least have a face shield nearby so that you're ready to use it when you're ready. Okay, so first things first, before we actually start cutting on here, we want to make sure that we have the right blade in place for the right job that we're doing. So in terms of the jobs, you have, basically it comes down to rip cuts or cross cuts. So if I open this little throat plate here, which keeps that blade in place, and also extends that table surface, and if I raise this up, you'll see the kind of blade I have in here. So right now I have a 40 tooth blade on here, and you can get blades that have more teeth, like a 60 tooth or an 80 tooth. This one happens to be a 40 tooth blade, and it's also a combination blade, so it's actually great for both rip cuts and cross cuts. But you can get blades that are made only for rip cuts and only for cross cuts. Again, so if you're, say you're in a production type setting and you know you're going to be making hundreds of cross cuts all at one time, then you might want to use a cross cut blade for that. Or same thing if you're doing rip cuts, if you're doing multiple rip cuts at one point, or one right after the other, then you might want to get a ripping blade for that. But again, the combo blade for a school shop like this one is totally fine, so it's not worth having to switch out the blades periodically, so having a nice combination blade like this one is really great. With that, you'll also notice there's a little, we kind of call it a shark fin around here, but it's, the technical term for it is a riving knife. And it sits back there essentially to, it helps prevent kickbacks for one, and it's also just a nice safety feature to have on here as well. It pushes back into place. So to demonstrate it without turning the saw on, so the saw is currently off, another safety thing. So if the blade is coming this way in this direction and I'm cutting something straight through here, this will actually, the riving knife will actually keep pieces of wood from binding onto itself. So say you have a piece of pressure treated wood or something like that and the outside had dried faster than the inside, so then it wants to kind of once you're cutting it, that heat that's generated from the saw makes it want to kind of come together again. So this is going to prevent that from happening and kicking back in your face. And we don't want kickbacks, obviously. So this is really great. So you always need to make sure that this is on there as well before you start cutting on here. Also, what happens too, because the blade is coming from this direction onward, so the riving knife also keeps it from wanting to shoot backward at you. So it's just a really nice safety feature to have on here. So again, this is the riving knife, and we have a combination blade on here. Right? Okay. So about the wood you want to be cutting, so I already mentioned that you don't want anything that has moisture, metal, or meat. So in terms of the wood itself, I have just a piece of poplar here. So you want to make sure, just like any other machine here, that there's no metal in it, no staples, no nails. You want to make sure that the wood is very dry first, because the moisture, the water content in the wood will set off the saw stop, and then that's a whole other expense, and we don't want to do that. And we don't want to cut into our digits, right? We don't want to cut into any part of our bodies. So no metal, moisture, or meat. That's a general rule of thumb there. Another thing about the wood, I mentioned this in the joiner and planer videos, I believe, but you also want to make sure you have at least one flat face and one flat edge, right? So you never want to do just like a piece of pine that you got from Lowe's and it's got a bunch of twists or bends or curves in it, and you never want to take that up to the table saw, right? So if I'm cutting it on the rip fence here, and I'll explain the rip fence in another video, I want to make sure that my piece of wood is nice and flat up against here, and it's nice and flat up against this fence, right? So the reason I want at least one flat face and one flat edge is so I can make parallel cuts along the edge, and then I have a nice flat surface to reference on, so it's not doing any kind of squirrely things on here, right? So one flat face, one flat edge. And your flat face is always up against the table, and your flat edge is always up against whatever surface you're cutting on, whether it's the rip fence or the cross-cut sled. And I'll get into cross-cut sleds again in another video. All right. Again, you want to just clean the area and make sure nothing's on the floor. And if you're working one right after the other in a school shop, then you want to make sure that the person before you cleans up after themselves, and you clean up after yourself, and so on and so forth. All right. You also want to make sure you adjust the table height and the table angle, or excuse me, the blade height and the blade angle. So to do that, and I'll make another video explaining what the bottom portion of the table saw looks like. So with the wheel directly in front of the blade, you can adjust the height. So in terms of adjusting the height, so I have a piece of roughly 3/4 inch thick piece of poplar here. So what I want to do is make sure I just clear one of the gullets on the blades here. So the gullet being those little pockets in between each of the saw teeth. So if I just clear one of the gullets here, so right around here is good. So maybe no more than a 1/2 inch above that surface. You can actually go a little bit less, so maybe about a 1/4 inch above that surface. That should be plenty. So if it's too low, what'll happen is the wood will kind of want to creep up. So it'll want to bounce up because it's competing with the back end of the blade. And if it's too high, then you have the same issue you have with the bandsaw, where you have too much blade exposed and possible digits being harmed. So we don't want that to happen either. So I would say roughly about a 1/4 inch above the surface of your wood is about right. Okay. In terms of adjusting the angle, that's with a wheel on the other side here. And again, in another video, I'll explain what all the wheels look like down here. So you can actually adjust the angle anywhere from 90 degrees where it's set up now, and it'll go this way to all the way to 45 degrees. So if you're cutting like a French cleat or something and you need two pieces to be right at a 45, then you can set this at 45 and cut your 2 strips, and you got your French cleat, right? Same thing if you're cutting out miters. So if you're doing miters on here, then you could set this to a 45, or if you're making a hexagon, you could set it to 30, and then, or not 30, but at 60, and then you can make hexagonal frames and whatever you want and whatever angles you need, really. So you want to make sure that that's set up appropriately as well. And with that said, if you have this set at a particular angle outside of 90 degrees, you want to make sure to always set it back to 90. And to do that, you can either use a combination square, or they even have digital miter gauges as well, which I tend to use pretty frequently. And again, I'll explain those in another video as well. Okay, so that's that. So then you'll want to set up whatever tool you're going to be using. So if you're using a rip fence, you'll want to set that up to whatever width you want to cut. So you'll see here, just like on the bandsaw, there is a measurement scale on here. And when you're using the rip fence, there's actually two little gauges on here. You want to use the gauge that's on the right side of the fence, right? So to get an accurate measurement. The other gauge is for if you happen to be using the rip fence on the other side of the saw. All right, so if I want to set this, so to set this, it's just like the one on the bandsaw. You lift this lever up, you push it forward. If I just want to cut a little bit off, let's say I set this to 5 inches, and then I lock it back down, and then it's set up at 5 inches, right? So then that's ready to cut. So then you'll want to set this up. We also have a cross-cut sled here, which is this big old guy. See if you can see that. All right, so this is a cross-cut sled here. So if I wanted to set this up, I'll get this out of the way. And you'll see there are 2 channels on here, and underneath this cross-cut sled, there are these 2 little strips of wood that follow those channels. I can set that in, and now I can do my cross-cuts, right? So I can set that up accordingly. Now that I have a piece of plywood on here for my cross-cut sled, I'll need to adjust that height to, again, be a 1/4 inch above the surface of my piece of wood. So you'll want to set that up accordingly as well. And I'll get into the cross-cut sled in the cross-cut video, along with the rip fence. So that's that. You can also set up a miter gauge on here. So I'll set this aside for just a second. So here we have a miter gauge, and actually can work on either side. So that just slips into here. And I put a nice little extension on here, so I can actually take a piece of wood and cut it just like so. And I can set this up at an angle. It works just the same as the one we demonstrated on the bandsaw. So I can set it up to a different angle, and I can actually make compound angles in this respect too. So there's that. So again, depending on the job that you're doing, if you're doing rip cuts, which is going with the grain of the wood, or cross cuts going against the, going across the grain, so going this way. So then you'll set up whichever one of these devices accordingly. So I'll set this aside. Okay. So you'll also want to make sure the dust collection is on for this. I don't have my assistant here today, so I'll be leaving it off. But you do want to make sure that the dust collection is on, because this does accumulate a ton of dust. So just do make sure that the dust collection's on, the gate to the dust collection is open as well. Okay. So some other general safety precautions you want to take. So my board here, my piece of poplar, is pretty narrow. I think it's about 5.5 inches roughly. So say I wanted to cut this at 3 inches, right? So this is already kind of on the narrow side, right? So if I push forward with my hand this way, my hand's going to be pretty close to that blade. So what I want to use instead is a push stick. All right. So we've talked about the push stick in the bandsaw video. So again, this is just a sacrificial hand. So it's going to keep this in place here, and then I will push forward with the push stick. And you'll notice I'm not pushing all the way up against the fence here. All right. So I'm not pushing it all the way against here. So generally speaking, you'll kind of eyeball center and go just left of that. And the reason we do that is because you're not only pushing forward, but by putting it just left of center, you're also keeping it up against the fence. It's actually easier to keep it up against the fence that way, because you're putting a little bit more pressure going towards the fence. All right, and my left hand's doing that as well, but at a certain point, my left hand's just gonna stay in place and move forward. So just to demonstrate that, I'll just move this out of the way. All right, so my left hand is always staying up against here. My right hand's pushing forward, and my push stick is right in place, so I usually just keep it right around here. And I'll push forward, push forward, push forward. And I'll switch to this, and again, just left to center, and push all the way through, just like that. All right, and I'll actually demonstrate this in the rip cut video, but just so you guys know. Okay, so I already talked about the kind of wood you want to have on here, so only clean wood, again, no moisture, metal, meat. So another thing you want to do is to stand on one side of the blade. So you'll notice I'm standing just to the left of the blade here, and that's because I can have a potential kickback. So a kickback, again, is when a piece of wood might get, so say the riving knife isn't on here, so the kickback gets maybe stuck back here, and because the pressure of the blade is going so fast, it actually pushes it backward that way. So if I'm standing right in front of it like this, that's going to be a really bad day for my crotch, right? So you always want to make sure to stand just to the left side of that blade. I've also seen people do this, which is a big no-no. So you always just want to stand on this side, so just left of the blade. So if there is any kickback, it's going to go right past you and to one of my other machines back there, unfortunately. So just make sure to do that as well. When the blade's running, you never want to reach across it, which seems obvious, right? But some people don't know that. So say I'm at the end of my cut, right? Push that all the way through, and while this is still running, I want to reach for this and push it out of the way. So I don't want to do that. I just want to make sure that I stop the machine completely, let it come to a full stop, and then I can move my piece out of the way, right? So again, seems obvious, but it is worth mentioning. Okay, stand on one side. Never cut freehand on here. Okay, so one of the scariest things I've ever seen, this was as a grad student, I saw a student trying to cut a piece of wood just like this and gonna cut freehand. So the fence wasn't even here, it's just gonna do something like this. And that is a huge, huge, huge no-no, because the blade is going to stay in one place, right? So if I'm cutting freehand like this, my hand is not going to necessarily be steady. So if I twist while the blade is cutting into it, it's going to flip and do some weird wonky shit back that way, right? So we don't want that, or wonky stuff, excuse me, I had an expletive. So we don't want to ever, ever, ever cut freehand on here. Again, you always want to make sure you're using a rip fence, a cross-cut sled, or the miter gauge. And with that said, you always want to support the longest side of the board. So if you're not sure which one you're cutting, or if you're cutting a square, for example, it doesn't really matter. But again, so long side of my board is here, and I'm making a rip cut, so I'm supporting it here. Same thing with the cross-cut sled. My long side would be here, so I need to support this side. Okay. With that, you never want to use the cross-cut sled and the rip fence at the same time. So just to give you an example, I'll set this up again. So the tendency might be to set this up to whatever you want to cut it at. So say it's set up right here, and then use that as your measurement to cut that board. So you never want to do that. And the reason is because your piece of wood could get stuck here, and it could get bound up in between the fence and the blade itself, and that could potentially be a really bad kickback. So you never want to do these at the same time, ever, ever, ever. Right? So set that aside. Okay. If you need to make any adjustments to the machine, you want to make sure, like if you need to change the angle, if you need to change the height, just to make sure to do that while the machine isn't running anymore. The tendency might be if your table saw is a little low, just like raise it up while it's still running, but try not to do that because it's just another safety precaution, right? Do not let small pieces accumulate towards this end here. So let's say, for example, I'm cutting lots of little squares out, right? Say I'm cutting like a bunch of little, push that aside. So say I'm cutting a bunch of little squares on this side, right? And I'm just doing a bunch of little cuts, moving over, cutting, moving over, cutting. What'll happen is a bunch of little pieces will accumulate back here. And because there's air traveling through here, because the blade's going in at such a high speed, that could move the pieces into the blade and could potentially cause a kickback. It won't be a minor kickback, but a kickback nevertheless. So you just want to make sure not to accumulate pieces on this edge of the saw. So if you're making a bunch of little pieces, just make sure that you're pushing this all the way through, like all the way through behind it, so the pieces are at least out of the way. All right? Do not push any scraps away with your hands. So with that said, that's why whenever we're using the rip fence, crosscut sled, or the miter gauge, you always want to make sure to pass all the way through, right? So then you're pushing away the scraps as you're pushing away your piece of wood. So you never want to just take that piece of wood, like I said earlier, and while this is running, push that away, right? So basic sense there. And last but not least, if you're helping someone cut a large piece of wood, say like a 4x8 piece of plywood, so if you're just supporting that person, make sure you're just supporting the board. So the person who's actually doing the cutting should be on the cutting end here, making sure it's right up against that fence and pushing forward, and you're just helping support it on the other end there. So I think that's pretty much the safety precautions. Couple other things, if the blade is dull, you can usually tell by it burning the wood or it's being really hard to push through the wood. So just make sure that if that's happening, just to stop the machine completely and get your shop tech, or myself in this case, and we can either clean that blade or replace it with a brand new one. And if you're unsure of an operation, just like anything else in here, if you're not sure how to use it, just ask, right? So we're here for you, right? Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. Be sure to watch the other table saw videos.